I'd like to share a story with you that comes to us from the Buddhist tradition. Once upon a time in an ancient Chinese village, there was an old woman. She had two large pots, each hung on the opposite ends of a pole that she carried across her shoulders, and she used it to bring water to her home from the nearby stream. One of the pots had a crack in it, while the other pot was perfect. The perfect pot always delivered a full portion of water to her home. But after the long walk from the stream to the old woman's house, the cracked pot arrived only half full, having dripped out water all the way back from the river. Of course, the perfect pot was proud of its accomplishments, but the poor cracked pot, ashamed of its imperfection. One day, while by the stream, the cracked pot spoke to the woman. It said to the woman, "I'm ashamed of myself, because this crack in my side causes water to leak out all the way back to your home." The old woman smiled and said, "Did you notice that there are flowers growing on your side of the path, but none on the other side?" This message, the message of today's service, comes in many ways and in many forms from many traditions and many messengers. We now move from that ancient Chinese Buddhist story to an ancient Japanese art form called Kintsugi, as interpreted in song by Peter Mayer.
I'm like one of those Japanese bowls that were made long ago. I have some cracks in me. They have been filled with gold. That's what they used back then, when they had a bowl to mend. It did not hide the cracks, it made them shine instead. So now every old scar shows from every time I broke, and anyone's eyes can see I'm not what I used to be. But in a collector's mind, all of these jagged lines make me more beautiful and worth a much higher price. I'm like one of those Japanese bowls. I was made long ago. I have some cracks you can see how they shine of gold.
Forget your perfect offerings. There's a crack in everything. That's what lets the light in, or what waters the flowers. Don't hide the crack, fill it with gold. It adds beauty to the object or the person. It makes it more valuable. In other words, let go of that preoccupation with perfectionism, those perfectionist tendencies and the judgment and anger and disappointment that comes when we make a mistake, when we fall short. Embrace what those errors, those imperfections have to teach us. And don't get stuck in insisting upon what you think is perfect in others. Let go. See things differently. Grow spiritually. Live happier. And have more to share with the world. Find the blessings in the imperfections. Well, that's the message in a nutshell. But for me, it's been a hard lesson to learn. These teachings are ones with which I still struggle, and I bet I'm not alone. I also feel that in this time of COVID, of Zoom services, of living on a computer, of being cooped up, perhaps it's made us even less tolerant of the imperfections in ourselves and in others, and more driven to get it exactly right, perfect, or to want it exactly perfect, as we define perfect. This morning I'd like to reflect with you a bit on this drive we have towards perfection, this expectation we have of ourselves and others, and even our institutions and organizations like our fellowship. I want to explore how, if we could let go of some of that, we might find beauty, value, even truth, even blessings in the imperfections. Now, for those of you who have endured some of my unproofread emails, you know that this perfectionist streak in me does not hold sway over all aspects of my life. But in many ways, I have indeed felt the need to be perfect, or at least as close to that as is humanly possible. Psychiatrists tell us that we pick up this trait, like many others, at a very early age. And I think I got that need to be perfect, to be the best and nothing less, and to expect the same from others at a pretty early age. I believe, at least in part, I got it from my father. My father was a wonderful man in many ways, but he was one of those people who found faults with everything you do and instilled this idea that everything you did had to be perfect. He insisted on it in himself and in others, and he had little patience with falling short, even slightly. If I brought home an exam paper from school with a grade of 99, he would ask, "Why didn't you get 100?" But I think there is more to this than just the tendency towards perfectionism that some of us have, just as a behavior that we think of as living up to our parents' expectations. Perfectionism in some part of your life can also be a way of compensating for some other part where you may feel inadequate. It took me a long time to accept the fact that I, like other gay men of my age, suffered from what has come to be known as the best little boy in the world syndrome. The idea that we have to be better than the next person at whatever we do so that being gay won't be held against us. Now, I know women in the professional and business worlds who have had a similar experience of driving towards perfectionism as a way of compensating for being female. There is a sense that if you are so good in some way, then your boss or your neighbor or even your family will have to accept you, even if they have a negative view of some other part of you. I have to acknowledge now that sometimes true greatness emerges from this kind of struggle. For many years, Malcolm and I shared our home with Uncle T, a famous concert pianist. He grew up at a time when the world wasn't even using the word gay, and he was ostracized and discriminated against because of who he was. He threw himself into his piano studies and became a truly great concert pianist, winning the Naumburg Award in 1940. And he often said, I had to play perfectly so they would not hold who I was against me. There certainly are many other stories of greatness that follow this path, but it can also be a behavior that is very unhealthy and destructive in our lives and in the lives of those around us. You know, it's great to be motivated to do a good job, and I'm not encouraging a sloppy and irresponsible way of life or a failure to live up to one's potential, but rather to suggest we be a little easier on ourselves and on others around us. The strive for perfectionism can really hold us back from so many things. The perfectionist's unending focus on what's wrong can cause us to overlook what's wonderful. We can get really stuck in our perfectionism, and it can preclude us from creatively moving on to the next chapter in our lives. I have a friend who's a very well-known Provincetown painter and who has a very heavy dose of perfectionist tendencies. Several years ago, she traveled to the area where she grew up, and she found her favorite tree still standing in the middle of a field. She got out the canvas and the paints and began to work. She took photographs so that she could use them to finish the painting when she got back to her studio. When she returned, she worked and worked on that painting for months, redoing this branch, that branch, changing the way the light cast its shadow. She even sanded the painting to try and change its effect. She didn't want to show it to anyone because it was not finished. She had not yet got it right. She was still fixing it. I did see the painting in several of its different incarnations, and they were all beautiful. But to her, it was not right. It was not perfect. She would spend entire days on that painting, and she was unable to move on to another. Her perfectionism, her desire to have this tree exactly right, held her from moving on and truly crippled her creativity. The author that some of you know, Julia Cameron, in her book, The Artist's Way, writes, perfectionism has nothing to do with getting it right. It has nothing to do with fixing things. It has nothing to do with standards. Perfectionism is the refusal to let yourself move ahead. It's a loop, an obsessive, debilitating closed system that causes you to get stuck in the details of what you're writing or painting or making and to lose sight of the whole. Instead of creating freely and allowing errors to reveal themselves later as insight, you often get mired in getting the details right. We correct our originality into uniformity that lacks passion and spontaneity. I have to say that I find those words to be rather stinging comments and maybe just even a bit overstated, but I get the point, and it hits home. What I often have to remind myself, and what my artist friend could not grasp, was expressed by Paul Gardner this way. A painting's never finished. It simply stops at an interesting place. not just a painting that we feel this way about. It could be a business proposal, a book you're writing, decorating your home, a sermon. All are really never finished to the perfectionist. There's always one more thing that you could tweak. Often I have the feeling that if I had more time, the sermon could be better. There's still words to change and ideas to develop. I could skip dinner with Malcolm and keep on working, or I could not make that pastoral call that I was going to make to keep working on the sermon. Or I can let go and accept the fact that it's good, or at least okay, and call it done. And again, I'm not suggesting that we should be lazy and not strive for high standards in our work, but there's a time to stop and say, what I've done is good. The late Unitarian Universalist minister Peter Fleck suggested that there's some theological precedent for being happy with less than perfection. Turns us to the Bible story of the 7-day creation. And at the end of each day in that story, God inspects his work and pronounces, it is good. Interestingly, you would have thought God to proclaim it perfect, not just good. As I read that story again this week, my reaction was, wow, a report cut of all B's. You mean God didn't get any A's for this creation stuff? Why was each aspect of creation just good? Fleck suggests it's because creation is not complete. There's more to come. If it were perfect, there would be no need for human creativity. If it were perfect, it would be over. It seems to me that God in the Genesis story is saying that creation is good enough for the moment. For a real perfectionist, very little ever lives up to their standards. Have you ever heard about a person or a place and developed such an image or an expectation in your mind that when you finally meet that person or visit that place, which you thought would be perfectly wonderful, you're disappointed because it didn't match your idea? When I was buying a home, I would have this experience. I'd review the real estate listing in great detail, look at all the pictures and read about it, and apply my vision of the perfect house to it. I would see the entire home in my head. And when I got to the house, I was always disappointed. Plato had something to say about this. He taught his students that only the idea of something is perfect, and its realization, its expression in material worldly terms, a mere shadow of that perfection. The medical profession tells us that perfectionism is not good for your health. It can literally break your heart, but it can also break the hearts of those around you. Perfectionists tend to live their life looking for what's wrong and trying to fix it. Do you always see or frequently see what's wrong in your spouse, your partner, your friend, your children? Is that how you approach them? Sure, kids need to be told when they're doing something wrong, and well-intended suggestions to a partner or a friend can be useful. But it's not the way to affirm a relationship. And like human beings, the institutions that we create are equally imperfect. This one, our fellowship, and our Unitarian Universalist Association, both are not perfect institutions. There's always things that we don't get right. And truth is, what is perceived as perfect for one person at one point in time is not for another at another time. So we go down many roads. Some take us to successful places, but other times we miss the mark. Sometimes when folks first come to a church or a fellowship like ours, they're excited and they perceive it as perfect, only to be disappointed later when they realize it is not. You need to know we are imperfect, but you also need to know that just may be our greatest blessing. It is in embracing our imperfections that we find the resources to accept others with their imperfections, reconcile differences, comfort and be comforted, and to love and not judge others. It can also be the source of our creativity and our openness to new ideas and a gateway to a wonderful future. I, for one, don't want a perfect fellowship, for that's a stagnant institution where very little new is happening. Someone once said that church is a place where you can make mistakes. And sure, at times those mistakes will be aggravating or disappointing, but those imperfections can also be the cracks that let the light in and allow us to see things differently. As institutions and as individuals, we need to let our errors reveal themselves as insights. Many of you know that I've spent the first 20 years or so of my professional life as a trial lawyer, and part of that time as an assistant district attorney. And you could probably guess that perfection for a trial lawyer is winning the case. And for a DA, it's getting a conviction. And I remember that perfectionist drive. But I also remember a case I prosecuted as a young assistant DA. I remember not fully interrogating a witness prior to the trial, a witness who was accusing another person of a very serious crime. In the middle of the trial, it became clear to me that I was doing a pretty good job of prosecuting an innocent person who might well get convicted and be punished. So I asked for a recess and confronted that witness in my office, who eventually confessed his lying to me. I was wrong in prosecuting the case, and I should have known that. I had to be very public in acknowledging that. I did, and the case was dismissed on my motion. My error in this case gave me new insight into how to approach a case, how to evaluate a witness. And even with the pain of a bit of public humiliation, the light of justice came through the cracks. Had I not made that error and acknowledged that error, I'm not sure when that insight which blessed my career would have come to me. It was a pretty big mistake. I could have just pushed on with the trial in order to try and maintain my near perfect courtroom record. But instead, my career and my life was blessed by the mistake. And I like to think the lives of others were too, certainly the person on trial. But years later, when I was supervising other young DAs, I stopped the practice of calculating conviction rate scores for their evaluation. And I knew the better DA, the one to promote, was not the one with the highest conviction rate, not the one driven to have perfect score. This is just one example in my life of where letting go of the desire to be perfect, acknowledging and embracing a mistake, opened me to new insight. In working with church volunteers in my next career and supervising a fairly large church staff, I learned that insisting on my idea of perfection in their work was not healthy for them, or for me, or for the institution. It stifled creativity, discouraged taking a risk, and held us back from embracing change. But we learned. We learned to value relationships over accomplishments, cooperation over competition. And we created an environment where we could discuss the opportunities that lie in our individual or collective missteps. Now, I've come to believe that what the liberal church, liberal religion is all about is learning to live the best we can in this world with the creativity, the love, and the compassion that our own imperfections teach us. The perfect church or fellowship sits still, but the one that lets the light shined through the cracks of its imperfection, is on the move to a richer, deeper, happier future. The poet William Stafford wrote, "Your exact errors make a music. Your straying feet find the great dance. And you live on a world where stumbling always leads home." By embracing our imperfections, our creativity continues to flow. Our errors may just be the route to the new chapter in our life. Even from the world of science, we can learn the importance of the imperfect. One Lewis Thomas wrote this: "We know a lot about DNA, but if our kind of mind had been confronted with the problem of designing a similar replicating molecule, we'd never have succeeded. We would have made one fatal mistake. Our molecule would have been perfect. The capacity for blunder slightly is the real marvel of DNA. Without this special attribute, we would still be anaerobic bacteria, and there would be no music." Well, maybe it's counterintuitive. We're so programmed to strive for perfection and the best. It takes a lot to push back against that drive, to embrace our imperfections as well as our successes, and to live in less perfect, but healthier, happier, more honest, and more meaningful ways. Well, again, here I am coming to the end of a sermon. And what am I thinking? It's not perfect. If I spend more time on it, it could be better. Well, I'm going to try and follow my own advice. I'm going to declare it good, at least okay. Certainly not the final word on the subject, but hopefully an interesting place to stop. So I give it to you as my imperfect offering. I hope there's a little light in it to share, even if it comes through the cracks. Blessed are the cracks, for they let in the light. And now I invite you to join in singing a hymn of gratitude for all that is our lives, the perfect and the imperfect, the wonderful and the difficult.